Do you ever sit down at your desk with your iPad or your sketchbook, so excited to finally get to make some art, and then you just sit there? Coming up with ideas can be hard. It is ironically disconnected from the desire to make things, from the physical act of making. It is often emotional and mental, and for many of us, it depends upon our mood. In this episode, we are going to talk about coming up with ideas for your art, starting with things you can do to churn up ideas, some actual strategies, and then inhibitors, things that can make it more difficult to develop an artistic idea. If you want to skip to any of those topics specifically, check out the timestamps in the description. My name is Zach, and if you enjoy this podcast or it benefits you, please consider subscribing. We do not live in a vacuum. Indeed, every interaction, every new piece of information that we discover in our lives is added to the incomprehensibly large file server that is our memory. Every experience adds something to the information we have stored, and as such, experiencing more of life can make coming up with ideas that much more natural. So let's go through some different things you can engage with that will give you more material to draw from, and make it easier to come up with ideas of your own. Reading books is the first thing that I want to focus on. The big thing with reading books is that you have to visualize what you're reading. If you watch a movie, if you watch TV shows, which will come up later, you have that visual information given to you immediately. But when you read a book, you have to take apart what you're reading and try to come up with what that thing looks like. This is distinctly different, and I think a very valuable thing for artists. I read a ton when I was a kid. I read The Lord of the Rings when I was in high school before the movies came out. As I began to watch the movies, I watched the visual information in my memory be overwritten. I can no longer go back and find what Frodo looked like in my mind upon my first reading. I can look at what Gollum looks like, but most of the characters have been overwritten by Peter Jackson's adaptation. In most cases, when you're reading a book, there isn't a visual media form of that yet, and you're able to construct these visual images of what all the characters look like, what all the places look like, what all the things look like, and you're uninhibited by anything else. And this forces you as a creative person, as an artist, to conjure up ideas. It's almost like a prompt for a project or an assignment in a class. If your teacher was to write something on the board and said, I'm going to give you a description of a character, I'm going to purposefully leave out some details. I'm not going to, give you 2 pages of information on what this character looks like. And then you have the whole class draw that character, you're going to get a lot of different things. You're going to run into different things that are specified and different things that aren't. Was race specified? Was hair color specified? Was eye color specified? Was height specified? Especially if you focus on just what they're wearing or even just character qualities, you can get wildly divergent versions of what these characters look like. And that's really beneficial for us as artists. So reading books is a really important thing. When I read Dune for the first time, I had all of these different odd visualizations, but everything in my head was so bleached out. It was so white and tan and light earth tones. And I haven't seen a Dune movie yet. I know that one exists, I haven't seen it yet. I haven't decided if I want to slaughter my visual memories and go see it, or if I want to hold on to what's still wedged in my brain. Because I've seen, obviously short pieces of footage from it or art from the movie, and it's different than what I have in my mind, and I'm not sure that I want to exchange those yet. When I read about things such as the sandworms, as the ornithopters, as the mining rigs, as House Atreides, when they describe the head of the boar in the Great Hall when they're first settling in, Lady Jessica is looking at it and talking about it. The way those things are described gives you distinct visual cues, and if you were to sit down then and draw those things, then it benefits you massively, but you don't have to. Just reading the books and putting these visual cues into your mind, into your memory, benefits you later when you're sitting down and trying to come up with ideas. Because you have to visualize those things yourself. And so if you decide that you are going to write something, you're going to come up with a comic or a story of some kind, you are going to have some practice with visualizing from written word, in your mind, and then transferring that down onto something else. And that's a wonderful, fundamental skill for all artists when they're trying to come up with ideas. I want to move into TV shows now, and I'll loop movies in here too. I don't have them as their separate component, but I think they do pretty similar things. When you sit down and watch a TV show or a movie, you are being spoon-fed visual information. Moving on from books, that might sound like it's a distinctly negative thing, but it's not. It's different. There are benefits to both, and I think that as an artist, it's beneficial to engage in both. Whereas a book forces you to visualize things for yourself and create your own ideas, a movie or a TV show adds to your visual memory and adds to your visual repertoire. I grew up with Star Wars. It's difficult for me to go back and figure out when I first saw a Star Wars movie. We only owned Return of the Jedi growing up. I had some relatives who had the other two movies because only episode 4, 5, and 6 existed at that moment. And it was a treat when I traveled across the country to see my relatives in Ohio when I got to sit down and actually watch Empire Strikes Back, because I only got to do that once or twice a year. But having grown up watching those movies, my brain, when I sat down and thought about space travel, about science fiction, was distinctly flavored by Star Wars. And so a lot of the spaceships that I drew were, riffs on X-Wings, on Y-Wings, on B-Wings. I love the B-Wing. It doesn't get enough screen time. It's really intriguing in how it moves and whatnot. And the Y-Wings always looked really lame, but they're bombers, like the TIE bombers. The TIE Interceptors were, of course, one of the coolest. But all of those things flavored what I thought of when I thought of science fiction. And so a lot of my early space drawings and science fiction drawings are hearkening to Star Wars, are hearkening to those things. So engaging in movies and TV shows adds to your visual memory. It adds to the things that you can draw upon when you're trying to come up with your own ideas. I would, however, specifically watch ones that are geared toward the work that you do. If you have a particular artistic style that speaks to you, watch shows that display that. Cartoons and anime can be great for this, but even TV shows with real people in them can have a distinct air that aligns with whatever it is that you want to work with. If you don't know what to watch, find documentaries. They often have beautiful cinematography and you'll get some information about the world to boot. I have watched mind-numbing quantities of nature documentaries over the years. I want to know all the things there are to know about animals, and so please give me more, David Attenborough. And so if you don't know specifically what to watch, watching things that are about the real world or shows like How It's Made, just teach you things about how the world functions, all of which adds to your visual memory. It adds to your understanding of the universe. And when you are sitting down to draw something, if you're sitting down to draw a robot and you've watched tons of Transformers shows, that's going to help. If you're sitting down to draw a robot and you've just watched hours and hours and hours of How It's Made, that's also going to help, but it's going to help in a much more grounded, realistic way. So if you're going to want to draw things and create things and fabricate things out of your mind, you have to be exposed to the real world equivalents or media equivalents of what those things are. The next thing that you can engage in that will add to your visual memory and potentially make it easier for you to come up with working ideas is video games. You probably knew that it was coming, and I can feel my mother tense up. So Mom, if you're listening, I love you. Not all video games are bad. There are plenty that have amazing stories and art direction. So games can be inspiring and they can fill your head up with all manner of ideas. The difference here from the reading media and from the visual media of TV shows or movies is that you are spoon-fed a lot of visual information, but in a lot of games, you have the ability to manipulate that and manage it to some degree. Even in a game like Sekiro, where you can't actually change what your character looks like, to my knowledge, you still have the ability to decide how you play, and so you're deciding how your character interacts with the world. It didn't take me long of playing Elden Ring before my sketchbook started having decaying trees and people with multiple limbs and things like that. Especially in a game like that, like Elden Ring, where you have so many different sets of attire that you can wear, you can design your character. If you played something like World of Warcraft, those games give you the ability to sculpt out your character and create an avatar that represents whatever it is that you want to play as. That gives you a lot of control over the visual stimuli that you're receiving as you play that game. It didn't take me a lot of time in Tears of the Kingdom before I started drawing floating islands. Armored Core 6 doesn't have me drawing mechs yet, but I am more fascinated with the world design and the large floating structures in this broken world. The art alone just gives me an emotional response to those kinds of things. The quick danger that I want to lay out here, and I'll talk about more later, is that don't trick yourself into thinking that your time playing video games is all beneficial for your artistic pursuits. If you're sitting down and playing 6 hours of video games a day and then drawing for half an hour, that's obviously a bad cycle. If your goal is to develop as an artist and become more proficient, then switch those. Maybe only engage in video games for an hour or so a day and then spend twice that amount of time working on your drawings and coming up with ideas. It's easy, especially when you're stressed about not being able to come up with an idea, to put yourself in a scenario where it's, I'm going to go play this video game or watch this TV show to come up with ideas. And then 6 hours later, you're like, I didn't draw anything. I'm terrible. So I don't want to expand on it too much here. I'll talk about it later, but I want to throw that out there, especially if my mom's listening. Here's another thing that you can do that can be super beneficial. Copy other people's work. It helps you to understand how other artists work and copying their methods as opposed to copying every single mark. This is important because if you sit down and you copy old Superman comics and your goal is just to replicate one for one, it's really not going to benefit you that much. It's going to teach you how to copy. But if you focus on looking at how that artist does things, I do this a lot. I look at people like Loish and a couple children's book authors recently on how they draw little kids. And I'm not sitting there trying to copy exactly. I'm dissecting. When you have the character facing this direction, where does the nose go? When you have the character facing up, how are you displaying the neck? I want to see the solutions they have toward problems. So, copy other artists' work. Work on fan art. Work from style guides if you can find them. There's a lot of people who've designed things like this. There's tons of stuff on YouTube, on TikTok, on Instagram, and all the other places that I don't visit because I'm old, that talk about, certain anime style guides. Like, this is how this artist draws this. Those things are beneficial if they give you information on how an artist solves a problem that you're going to run into as well. My favorite thing to do with this is just to dissect and understand how other artists solve their problems. My biggest problems as of late are working with compositional things and then the actual construction of how anatomical things go together. Like, I know how to draw an arm. I don't always know exactly how the arm connects to the torso, and so I get it right sometimes and I get it wrong other times, which is agitating. I almost feel like I would rather get it wrong every time, because then at least I knew what I needed to focus on. But when I get it right 40% of the time, it's just this weird haphazard situation. These next couple things that you can do to increase your visual memory and help you come up with ideas are a little bit more practical. The first one I want to throw out there is get out in the world around you and see how nature operates. Go to the zoo, look at animals and plants. If you have animals in your house, if you have a cat or a dog, sit down sometime and just watch how they move. Sketch that, draw that, but focus on it. Try to understand what it is about them and how they function. We've got bird feeders on our deck, and I like to sit and watch the birds sometime and see how they interact with one another. Not just how they move and how they fly, because a magpie and a blue jay and a sparrow all move tremendously differently because they all have this crazy difference in their mass and their volume. But watching animals, plants, and the world around you and how those things interact with one another can't help but expand what you have inside your mind. If you get out and you hike, if you use your breaks at work to go for a walk in a neighborhood or in a natural space, you will run into things that you didn't anticipate. And naturally, those things will add to your visual memories, will add to the things that you contemplate and think about when you sit down to make art. Try people watching. This is particularly interesting if you're in a place like an airport, or if you use public transit to get to and from your job each day. You will see tons of humans, and it's easy to just throw in your headphones and listen to something on YouTube like this or some music, but sometimes maybe you should try putting in those headphones, putting nothing on, just so nobody bothers you, because, that's exactly how all of us as artists want to be, and then just watch people. See how they interact. See how they move. See what you can tell about them or little stories that you construct about them as you watch them move through their daily life. You can do this in a coffee shop or in a restaurant. You can do this when you're out in nature, when you're hiking or biking or something like that. But watch humans. So many of us, our end goal is to represent humans, to draw figures, to design characters, to work in video games or whatever. But most of us have some tie-in with humans. So watch them. Watch how they move, watch how they live. And you can't help but learn and glean new things and add to the information that's already floating around in your mind about how people function. If you have the ability, get out and travel. If you live in the US, please get out. Go somewhere not here. The United States is such a massive monolith that it's too easy to assume, without even knowing that you're doing so, that the way we do things here is simply the way things are done. It's easy to say soup for breakfast is weird, that beans on toast is gross, or that pickled fish is revolting, but those are only weird to a certain sensibility. The things that we do here in the United States are often very strange and very weird to other cultures around the world. Driving on the wrong side of the road leaks out of American mouths when they talk about the UK's driving situation, but it's only wrong from our particular point of view. So getting out of your normal is one of the best things you can ever do as an artist. If you write or world build, it's probably even more important. I've had the privilege of being to Iceland a couple times. I grew up in England for a time when my dad was flying for the United States Air Force. I've traveled to the Azores, to Mexico, to a couple other places. I've been privileged in that capacity. But every single time that I've done that, I've learned new things about humans, new things about how the world functions. When I went to Italy and was all of a sudden seeing fruits on trees in people's backyards that I had to purchase for in exorbitant prices back home, that was crazy. I know in my mind that obviously oranges and, avocados and things grow somewhere, but I live in Colorado and the winters are too harsh. So a lot of things that would grow in California or Florida don't grow here. And when you get out of your normal, you see things like that are really little things on the grand scheme of life, but they start shaping how you operate, how you think about the world. When I went to Iceland the first time, my wife and I were hiking way off a trail, maybe 3 or 4 miles off of a little area that we parked. We walked alongside streams that were literally steaming from geothermal activity. The pathway wound itself around these little teeny hills and mountain passages, and there were tiny bridges over creeks, but there were places where the path had literally collapsed and fallen into a steaming vat of mud. And in that moment, I'm sitting there contemplating, if I just brain dead walked down this path and fell into that vat of boiling liquid, I would die. And that stuff doesn't happen in the US. There's fences and there's caution signs everywhere in every national park because they don't want to get sued, presumably. Or maybe it's actually, there's some good human quality there and they don't want people to get hurt. In Iceland, we were on a glacier and we were walking, and this guy walks out in front of us and just scoots across the glacier, not wearing the correct gear in any capacity, and I was flabbergasted. I turned to the guide that we had next to us and asked him, I said, is there any law, is there anything that prevents him from doing that? And he just kind of shook his head and said, no, we kind of just figure that if he knows what he's doing, then he'll be fine. And if he's being an idiot and he dies, then at least he can't breed. And that's a tremendously different perspective than what we have here most of the time in the United States. So if you have the ability, especially if you're young, you've just finished high school, you've just finished college, I cannot recommend enough traveling, getting out of your normal. And when you're young, you can do it for much cheaper. So if you have the ability to do so, please do. If you live in Europe, it's much easier because you can get around via trains and things. If you live in the United States, you can go to Canada. You can go to any of the states that you haven't visited. I know this might sound weird to a lot of people who live outside of the US, but most people in the United States have only been to a tiny little fraction of the states. There's 50 of them. Most people in Colorado that have grown up here have probably only been to maybe 5 to 10. So if you live in Colorado, get to California, go to Florida, go to Maine, go to Oregon. Just travel. If you have the ability, travel. Get out of your normal. It can only benefit you as it applies to coming up with new ideas. The last one on this episode before we go into actual strategies is journaling. This is something that I think gets overlooked by a lot of people. Write down random ideas as they come to you and always have a place to do so. I have notes in my phone for this, and sometimes I'm in the middle of a conversation and it's awkward, and sometimes it's in the middle of the night, but I don't want to lose out on my ideas. Things just pop up sometimes, and I'm sure this happens to you guys as well. So when those ideas pop up, just have a predefined place that you can throw those ideas. I have a notebook when I don't have any internet access or I don't have any technology. I have my phone, and a lot of times I have my computer with me. But it's just important to have a place to put down ideas when they pop up. It's also not a bad idea if you're able to stick to the routine of journaling daily. You will see some weird things unravel in your psyche and in your mental processes as that goes on. So if you have the dedication to do it, please consider working on a journal daily. I struggle with this. I'll usually hit a chunk of time where I'll work on a journal for a week or two, and then I'll forget for 6 months. So I'm better about sticking to my art or my writing and doing that every single day, but journaling is a little harder for me. If you dream, write them down. The weird chaos of the dream realm can honestly fuel ideas in every shape and form. I don't often have dreams, but I have a lot of my students from the past couple years that have crazy, vivid, ridiculous dreams, and each of those could just branch out into a myriad of ideas. Some of them honestly read like comics or stories in their own right. So if you have vivid dreams, interesting dreams, write them down so they're a resource for you later. All right, those were wonderful things that you can do, things that you can engage in that will help you have more pieces and parts floating around in your mind to pull from when it comes to creating ideas. Let's talk about some actual strategies, some actual things you can do if you're sitting down and your desire to come up with some ideas right now. Try asking yourself, what if? What if whales could fly? What if there was a planet made of only water? What if robots could express emotion, and what would that look like? Sitting down and asking yourself a question is one of the best ways you can start coming up with ideas for your drawing, your writing, or whatever art you find yourself working on at the moment. Think about the concept for a moment of what if whales could fly? Well, whales are massive, large creatures that exist in the water. So in order for them to fly, you'd probably have to have a situation where gravity was different, because things that exist in the ocean are neutrally buoyant, thus they're allowed to be much, much larger. It's why when whales beach themselves, they slowly die, because their bodies are not built to hold all of that weight. When they're existing in the water, a lot of that weight is displaced. They feel lighter. So a lot of people have solved this issue by having them float. You have a planet like Jupiter where gravity functions a little bit differently, or it's a gas giant, or you have these whales have large sacs in their body that are full of something like helium that allows them to float, that makes them lighter. You start playing around with an idea like that, and pretty quickly you're going, well, what do they eat? Well, in the ocean, they eat things like plankton or krill, or some of them hunt. But let's think about the big, baleen whales for a moment. So the ones that eat things like krill. Well, could you have krill that also live in the air then? Could you have something similar? Could you have mayflies or insects that swarm in these massive, massive, terrible writhing balls in the sky, and the whales hunt them down in the same way that they do in the water? Because in the water, they live in 3 dimensions. The difference is that often whales will push things to the surface because the krill or the fish that they're hunting can't go above the surface of the water. But maybe you could invert that, and they actually chase things down to the surface of the ground or down to the surface of water. And all of the little insects that they're chasing can't go through that barrier, and so they're then using that to herd them and to catch them and eat them. But asking yourself, what if? Just giving yourself a series of questions is one of the best things you can do for coming up with an idea. I think if you actually go through a lot of your favorite movies, you're going to come up with, this was just a what if question. The Iron Giant, which is a fantastic movie. Every time I think about it, though, I just think about the fact that Vin Diesel is the giant, and that's hilarious to me. It makes him being Groot later on a lot more reasonable. But the premise behind the Iron Giant movie is, what if a gun had, a heart and didn't want to be a gun, didn't want to kill people? And you get this really cool abstracted version of that in the movie, and it's really wonderful. Star Wars is kind of, what if you had wizards in space? Because the Jedi, as much as people don't want to think about it, the Jedi are wizards, and Star Wars is not science fiction, it's actually fantasy, set in a science fiction setting. Dune tells the story of what if humanity continued for far too long, rejected technology, and tried to develop themselves instead, and you get all of these things that kind of roll out from there. The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are based on what if there was a pre-existing mythology for the UK that hadn't been lost. Tolkien was famously upset with the fact that his people's mythologies had been lost or destroyed, and so that was his goal, was to create something that could exist as a mythology of the UK. So a lot of our favorite TV shows and stories and comics and things come from that manner of premise. I think even, Superman is basically, what if there was a character who was fueled by the sun and who was ludicrously strong? Well, it's fun to tell stories, and then over time you get to the idea of, okay, well, if you have a foe that's basically, if you have a hero who's basically more powerful than anything else, how do you tell interesting stories there? And that's, I think, one of the reasons why the comics do a much better job with Superman than movies ever have. Here's another great strategy for coming up with ideas. Take a given idea and then twist it. So what if the good guys lost? So think of Lord of the Rings again for a second, and they got to Mount Doom, and then Frodo, decides to keep the ring. They accidentally killed Smeagol earlier. And so Frodo just has the ring, and Sam can't do anything, and then, Frodo succumbs, Sauron reclaims the ring, he spreads the second darkness over all of Middle-earth, and he wins. What does that look like? What kind of story unravels from there? What could you draw, what could you write and pull apart from those ideas? So take that idea and twist it. If you look at Marvel Infinity War, at the end, Thanos wins. And I walked out of that movie going this is great. I know they're going to make another movie where they fix this, and I really hope they don't. I think that if they hadn't made Endgame and Thanos had just kind of won, that would have been wonderful. It's this, depressing story, but it's kind of real in a way. We're just humans. We're tiny little beings. And this guy is a titan and a deviant and a mutant, and he was just too much for us. But the stories and the things that you can work from after something like that happens are really intriguing. So what if you take cowboys and you put them in space? What if you, as much as I despise time travel for me personally, what if you take really futuristic people and you send them way back in time to the Middle Ages and they have to figure that out? What if you had a reality where humans were actually sharks? What would our daily life look like? How does a shark hold a phone? I don't know. But all of these are the kinds of things that you can do to manipulate yourself and come up with ideas. So take a given idea and twist it. Here's kind of a fun one. Find a random word generator. Give it a prompt for 5 words or 10 words, and then just let it go. And whatever it gives you, you have to draw that thing. I used to do a lot of things like this with my students. We did warm-ups twice a week, and I would come up with them out of my strange, brain. And I would do things like this. I'm able to come up with ideas pretty quickly, pretty swiftly, mostly because I'm uninhibited. I'm not worried about coming up with a bad idea, so I can just go. But this is the kind of thing that I would do. I would just sit there and I would brainstorm out I think it was about a dozen ideas a week. And I would do 6 or 8 of them on Monday and 6 or 8 of them on Wednesday. And the students would have to sit there for 5 minutes. They would draw one of these random prompts that I gave them. And it might be a mechanical porcupine. It might be a device that changes the weather. It might be a cactus that could live in the Antarctic. It might be Abraham Lincoln if he had survived and he's a zombie now. It would be random things like that. Totally ridiculous. But the students, by and large, enjoyed those. And even when they didn't enjoy them, they benefited from them. Because having to draw something that is totally different than what you normally draw, having to draw something that is totally different than what you would normally come up with, is a really beneficial thing. This is fun. This is a good idea, I think, for most people. If you can find another person to give you prompts, great. But random word generators are also a really good idea. This might be something that would be beneficial for me to do for myself and for any of you who are listening as well. So if that sounds like a good thing, you would like me to come out with a list of weekly prompts that you can work on, just let me know in the comments below. I will happily do that. It would be kind of fun to re-engage in that. Here's another. Try taking something and inserting it into a developed universe. There's nothing wrong with fan art, so why not create a new ship for Star Wars? I was mentioning earlier the X-Wing, the Y-Wing, the B-Wing. They're named by letters, right? So what if you just went down that train of thought and you came up with a T-Wing or a Z-Wing? And those might exist now, or they might exist in the Legends canon. I've stayed out of Star Wars for the last decade in a silent act of betrayed, treasonous refusal to engage in the Disney Star Wars franchise. So, which could be its own video at another point. But take something and insert it into that arena. So this is probably going to be fan art derivative, but if you really love an anime, try drawing a character for that anime. If you really love a TV series, try drawing something that could fit into that TV series. You're banking off of something you already understand. The style's already been decided for you. A lot of the rules of that universe have already been decided, so there's fewer decisions to make. This might make it a little bit less stressful, and you can actually start moving forward and creating some things that are going to make it easier for you to do that, for you to come up with ideas. And a lot of times, It's just coming up with an initial idea to start working, and once you're working, things will flow and things will change, and you'll come up with other places that you want to go. So much of it is just the starting, sitting down and actually starting to work through a thing. Try practicing. So give yourself a set amount of time and brainstorm as many ideas for a drawing or writing prompt as you can. Give yourself 1 minute and then see what you can do, what you can come up with. Whatever that number is, do it again the next day and then keep pulling things apart. See if you're progressing. See if you maybe only came up with 3 the first day and you came up with 10 the next day. So as I was talking about this, I paused in my writing of the script and decided I should probably do this. That would only be fair, right? So I took a break from writing this script and I gave myself 2 minutes and no prep, because I knew that if I sat and thought about it in the background for a couple minutes, then I would naturally start coming up with things. So I came up with 14 ideas. They're all pretty bad, but it's the practice and the work that's important. If you can spend a couple minutes here and there coming up with ideas, you're bound to find a nugget here and there. So here are my bad ideas, just in all fairness, for transparency's sake. A fish jumping over a boat, a giant holding a city in the palm of his hand, a cowboy riding a meteor, a robot with a hole where its heart should be, a squid with tentacles wrapped around the earth, a spaceman but inside the helmet is the earth, a woman whose dress becomes the ocean, a gorilla wearing a Nirvana t-shirt, a man stabbing a map with a knife to show where the party should go next, a little witch girl visiting a giant tree in a forest, a tree that grows lawn care machines instead of fruit, a planet with other planets as moons, a device that goes into suns and destroys them, Earth in 31,000 years after the third incarnation of humanity has taken over. So those were my 14 bad ideas that I came up with in that 120 seconds that I gave myself. Now, they're not great. If I gave myself a couple more minutes, I'm sure I could come up with tremendously better ideas, but the reality here is I took 2 minutes, and out of that, I probably have 2 prompts that would be interesting for me to work on. The little girl with the tree sounds really intriguing, and the squid wrapping its tentacles around the planet could be kind of a fun Inktober thing or something to draw. So try practicing. Try sitting down and actually giving yourself an assignment to work on coming up with ideas and see what happens. I do this with my video ideas. I have a list of maybe 150 different video ideas. I have massive lists of things that I want to draw. I have lists of things that I want to do when it comes to writing music. I think it's important when an idea pops up to write it down. I also think it's important to push yourself, to stress yourself a little bit, to grow, to keep coming up with ideas. So practice coming up with ideas. It might sound like the most fundamental and maybe lamest thing you could do as far as an activity to come up with more ideas, but there's not always a romantic answer to things. Sometimes the secret to doing a thing is just doing the thing really badly for a while, and you'll slowly get better at it, and you'll slowly start to accumulate more pieces that do what you want to do. All right, finally, let's talk about inhibitors, some things that can mess this up for you, some little road bumps that you can run into along the path that just make coming up with ideas that much more difficult. First of all, and I mentioned this earlier, you can imbibe too much media and trick yourself into thinking it's working. This probably comes the most into play with binge watching things and playing video games. If you want to be an artist who can come up with all kinds of ideas, whether it's painting, drawing, writing stories, whatever, it is important to take in media, to consume art. But the proportion with which you consume art versus create art is very, very important. I don't know what the magic ratio is. I think probably you need to spend 3 to 4 times more time working on your art than consuming art. So if you're watching 10 hours of media a week and your goal is to develop as an artist, you probably should be creating 30 or 40 hours a week. Now, if those two numbers added together seem absolutely unreasonable, that's probably true. Now, I don't want to discourage you from taking some downtime from your very difficult job or from school to just binge watch something, but just don't convince yourself that that is artistically innovative, that you are benefiting it yourself. It's okay to take some downtime and play a video game because work sucked today. On the other side, it's also important to consume some media. So make sure that you're balanced in how you're approaching this, and make sure that you don't trick yourself into thinking you're being productive by playing 25 hours in a row of World of Warcraft when you could have spent a fraction of that time drawing, and you'd have some things that you were happy with, you'd be progressing, and you'd be growing. Fear of failure is another one. This is huge. I've done a lot of videos on this. I will probably talk about this till the day that I die. When you workshop new ideas, there is a higher risk than normal of things going south. This is part of the process, and you have to get over this before you grab your pen or pencil. So, fear of failure is something that grips most humans, and I think perhaps artists and creatives more than others. Some of us are able to escape this by just having this insane urge to make things, but most creative people have a distinct fear of failure. Some of that's instilled by society. They put this pressure on us. We have this idea of the starving artist. So some of it's not fairly attributed to us, but the fear of failure is a real thing. And this extends and multiplies when your goal is to come up with new ideas. The 14 ideas that I mentioned earlier in this podcast, I'm unhappy with pretty much all of them. Even the 2 that I think are entertaining are underdeveloped. Is it reasonable for me to be hard on myself or to feel like that's a failure when I took 2 minutes to do it while I was in the process of coming up with video ideas and writing a script where my mind was totally distracted in a different headspace? No, it's unreasonable. Can I stop myself from thinking that way? Maybe, but it's gonna take some work. We're all the same in this capacity. We struggle with our own ideas. We think that our failures are more of a failure than they are frequently. So the fear of failure can very easily inhibit you from coming up with ideas. So you have to find ways to detach yourself from it. You have to assure yourself that this is part of the process. You need to give yourself enough time to come up with a lot of ideas, and your goal should not be to have 50% of them be good. Just be focused on maybe having one good idea from a brainstorming session. If you sit down and sketch a whole page of potential drawings and one of them works, success. Reframe failure. Failure is not having less than 100% of your pieces turn out the way you want. Success is walking away from that situation with one good idea. One good idea. Fear of copying or being unoriginal. This is a real thing, and I sincerely believe it's a waste of time. So these are my thoughts. 1, originality is overrated. People focus on being original all the time. I'm not even sure it's you were capable of doing it anymore. 2, it's difficult in most arenas to even assess if originality still exists. Solomon in Ecclesiastes said, "There is nothing new under the sun." If this was thought to be true then, it is certainly true now. 3, originality is often uninteresting. Something totally new is often incredibly difficult for people to understand, to buy into, or to enjoy. When someone stretches reality so much to get to something truly original, it is often tangible within their art, and this can be off-putting. So don't worry about being original with everything you do. If you run into something throughout all your work that does end up being original, wonderful. But it should not be an overarching goal throughout all of your work. It's simply too difficult to do. And you can have a wonderful idea that you've cultivated and you've tended and you've put a ton of time into, and then you find out that someone did something similar and you can feel so gutted. That's because you're focusing too much on being original. So make it originally yours. Don't worry about it being the only thing that has ever told this particular story, because we as humans are storytellers, and someone has probably told that story before. It doesn't dismantle your success. It doesn't mean your idea is bad. It really doesn't mean anything except for you are human. Now, when it comes to copying, don't be afraid to copy other artists' work. Don't plagiarize. Don't copy someone else's artwork and claim it was your idea. Don't steal their thunder. But there's nothing wrong with copying another artist's work to figure out how they do things. As I read through texts right now, as I'm working on writing my novel, I am dissecting how other authors write things. Am I going to copy exactly what they do? No, but I have certainly circled and copied words. I like this. I like that verb. I like that noun. I like how this, it's way more interesting to say this than just she said or he said. So I copy individual components. I do that with my artwork too. I don't want to sit down and spend 100 hours coming up with the idea of how I show this dragon in this pose. I can find 15 other artists and look at how they worked through a dragon from that perspective, and I can just mine the pieces that I want. There's nothing immoral with that. It is not a sin. It is not wrong. It is a part of being an artist. So don't fear copying other artists' work. Just don't claim it's your own, and don't do it with 100% of what you do. And don't let it keep you from coming up with ideas. Next, we have an oldie but goodie, overthinking. Who here hasn't been guilty of this? For me, I'd have an easier time counting the moments I am not currently overthinking something, to be honest. This is a ubiquitous part of my life. I constantly overthink everything. It's one of the reasons why crowds can stress me out and why I'm so introverted, is because when I'm around 100 people, I'm trying to contemplate all of the interactions between all of them, and it's just massively stressful. So I am a chronic overthinker. And when I overthink my ideas, it becomes progressively more difficult to actually commit and to come up with something new. So if this is you, try to walk away from it. Try to give yourself something that's really easy to start working on, instead of, focusing on it has to be this, it has to be this, it has to be this. Give yourself fewer requirements for what you're trying to come up with. And just remember that in the idea process, in the ideation process, you don't have to think about everything. You can turn your brain off a little bit. Sometimes this might mean putting on a TV show that's familiar to you and just having it play in the background to loosen yourself up a little bit. It could be listening to some of your favorite music. Whatever you can do to kind of reduce stress levels, or maybe even give your brain something to kind of tether itself to while you're ideating and coming up with things, that might be beneficial. But anything you can do to stop yourself from overthinking, overprocessing every teeny little component is going to be beneficial to you. I know it's super hard. This is one of those ones that's easier to mention, like, yes, you should stop procrastinating. Don't be a perfectionist. Stop overthinking. The biggest thing is, once you're aware of that attribute, you've determined that it's something you don't want to hold on to forever, you can then start disassembling it. It's not easy, but only then, I think, can you start actually disassembling it. The next thing here is a lack of practice. So I mentioned this in the actual strategies that you can go down. It's a skill that you have to practice. Coming up with ideas is a skill like many others, and it requires your time. It requires your time. It requires an investment of effort. Coming up with ideas is not an easy thing for everyone, in the same way that jumping into an instrument or learning a new artistic medium is not necessarily easy for everyone. Certain people come up with ideas faster and better than others, just like everything else in life. If you struggle to come up with ideas, it's not because you're uncreative. It's not because you lack the ability to do so. It's likely the fact that you haven't done it enough and you need to practice doing it more. Is everyone at the end of the day going to have the same level of being able to come up with ideas? No, I don't think so. But I do think that everyone can learn the skills to come up with ideas that are vaguely original, interesting, and more importantly, fun to play with. Coming up with ideas is difficult, but by consuming enough media, enough of the real world, and working through some of these techniques, I hope you can produce some really magnificent ideas of your own. As always, thanks for watching and listening. I appreciate it. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.